The Italian campaign of the Second World War can often be misunderstood, even by those at the time. Winston Churchill once called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe, and there was a feeling after the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 that the Allies could push on and be in Rome by Christmas. But that didn't happen. Standing in their way was the Gustav Line, a series of fortifications and minefields stretching the entire width of the country. It took in tough, mountainous terrain with its strongest point at the monastery of Monte Cassino, 1,700 feet above sea level. Break through here and the road to Rome would open up. That would eventually be the outcome. Yet the operation that began in January 1944 would see 5 months of some of the most attritional fighting of the entire war, heavy casualties and brutal winter conditions. This was the Battle of Monte Cassino. I'm James Hanson. This is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different historical battle, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today it's the Battle of Monte Cassino, 4 bruising Allied assaults which finally broke the Gustav Line and led to the liberation of Rome in June 1944. Yet how significant was it, and could things have been different here? That's a question for our experts, and joining me, as always, is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And for the first time on the channel, we're delighted to be joined by the historian, broadcaster, and author of Cassino 44, James Holland. Welcome to you both. Now, before we get into talking about the battle itself and the various assaults, James, thank you so much for joining us on History Undone. What is it about the Italian campaign in particular that fascinates you?
Well, it's a beautiful country, isn't it? It's a lovely place to visit. And I think, my fascination goes back sort of 20 years when I first learned about a terrible massacre that happened, civilian massacre that happened just south of Bologna, around an area called Montesoli. And I just thought, why on earth don't I know about this? So I went and investigated and ended up writing a book about it called Italy's Sorrow. And really, since then, I've written 3 other books about the campaign. So I've done it pretty thoroughly and completely out of chronology. So that was the first one. That's what drew me in. But, it's just such a great place to live, isn't it? To visit. And, I'm still battling away with Duolingo Italian. But
aren't we all? Cassino 44, how did you approach this one?
Well, it was originally going to be one book, but I did a book called Savage Storm last year, which was ended up being a book all on its own, all about the campaign in 1943, which I thought deserved a kind of a bit of attention. But it was sort of unfinished business with Cassino. I mean, it's the most iconic battle or series of battles of the Italian campaign, and it's one bit that I hadn't written about, so I really felt I ought to kind of sort of roll my sleeves up and try and tackle it.
And that is definitely the way to think about Monte Cassino, a series of battles, a series of assaults. We'll come on to that in a moment. Dr. Chris Parry, welcome as ever. Let's just first of all talk about the wider context of what is happening at this point in 1944. As you can see, we've got a map of the Italian peninsula in front of us. Few key points to point out first of all. This is the all-important Gustav Line that we'll be talking about a lot over the course of this episode. And there is Cassino itself. Couple of other things to mention. You've got Foggia just here, home to some key airfields, which we'll also talk about, I'm sure. Then you've got Anzio, where, of course, a beachhead is established. And then also, think of the Battle of Monte Cassino as really the battle for Rome and the battle to liberate Rome. And Rome is here. We will come on to that in due course as well. So, Dr. Chris Parry, give us a sense of where the war is at this point.
Well, there's a lot going on, and if you're Adolf Hitler right now, you're scrambling to see where the blows are going to come from. The Allies have landed in Sicily, and they've come up through Sicily pretty quickly, and it's been decided that there'll be an assault by 2 armies on the south of Italy. At the same time, of course, we've had the Battle of Kursk taking place on the Eastern Front, so there's all sorts of priorities. And what was interesting, of course, in Kursk was terminated because of the assault on Sicily by the Allies. It thoroughly spooked the Germans. But what you have essentially is 2 main armies. The 8th Army, which is landing in Calabria, commanded by Montgomery, and General Mark Clark, who commands the 5th Army, American Army predominantly, but with other Allied units attached, is going to land at Salerno in an amphibious assault. Now, meanwhile, the Germans essentially know something's happening, and they've got various contingency plans about what's going to happen. But what they don't expect is for the Allies to land this far south. And there's a very good reason for that, because this whole country here, as Mark Clark said, is behind every mountain, you've got a river. And behind every river, you've got a mountain. And the other thing he said was, all roads lead to Rome, and they're all mined. And so actually, for somebody who later on is, I think, going to be the villain of the piece, he was actually quite smart about the environment. So we've got a situation here with the 8th Army here. The 5th is going to land here in September of 1943. But here's an interesting thing. They're very keen to get hold of Taranto and Bari as ports to bring in supplies. Two armies need a lot of logistics. There's also the 8th Air Force that they want to bring in to operate from the 13 airfields around Foggia. So that's a lot of aviation fuel, spares, and things like that. So instead of actually coming up together so that Montgomery joins up with Clark here coming out of Salerno, they go from the toe to the heel of Italy. And it takes quite a lot of time to consolidate here. And all the while, the Luftwaffe is saying, well, we've got an interest here. And they're bombing what's going on around here. And there's a very famous incident where we've got some mustard gas in a ship. And that is bombed. And the whole area is covered in mustard gas. An ammunition ship is blown up. So the Germans actually are getting a vote in this. So they're trying to consolidate here. Meanwhile, at Salerno, the Germans actually know it's coming, because they've said, well, let's have a look at the map. That's quite a good bay to land in. And when the 5th Army arrives, it's in the teeth of quite a lot of opposition, and they have to fight their way out of Salerno. And it's pretty sort of touch and go. And what Clark sees at Salerno has a relevance later at Anzio as we go forward. But essentially, you've got the 5th Army, 8th Army, you've got 4 German divisions retreating back up towards the Gustav line. You've got 2 divisions at Rome, and Field Marshal Kesselring, who's in charge sort of in Italy, is trying to convince Hitler it's worth holding this down here. Hitler, in the meantime, says to Rommel, we've got 6 divisions in the Alps, best you hold that there. Now, there's one other factor you need to take into consideration. On the 25th of July of that year, just before this happens, the Italians get fed up with Mussolini and say, we don't want you anymore. And at that stage, the Germans are thinking, the Italians now going to go over to the other side. And the Italians say to the Allies, don't tell the Germans, don't tell anyone that we're thinking of coming over to your side, because it's going to get very sticky. Unfortunately, on the day of the landing of Salerno, Eisenhower, who's the Supreme Commander, decides he's going to tell everybody. And at that point, the Germans have to deal with, essentially, an Italian army that is now not on their side. They do a very smart thing. They send them all home.
And James Holland, I suppose a key point here is, whilst all this is happening, what is in the planning is Overlord.
Yeah, exactly. And this is really, the Italian campaign is launched as a help for Overlord. So Overlord is agreed, finally. I mean, it's on the agenda right in 1942 when the first American troops arrive in Britain. 1942 it becomes apparent that that's just not possible. Then it becomes apparent it's not even going to be possible in 1943. But by May 1943, at the Trident Conference in Washington, it's agreed by the combined chiefs of staff that it is going to be, Operation Overlord is going to be launched at this point in May 1944, so a year hence. And nothing is going to get in the way. And anything that does happen in between is going to be supporting that. And when Sicily falls on the 17th of August, 1943, it is agreed that it's going to be worth going into Italy for these 4 main reasons. One, to absolutely finally get Italy out of the war. And that happens, of course, because the armistice is announced. The surrender is signed on the 3rd of September. The armistice is announced on the evening of the 8th. And the main event, the Allied attack at Salerno, is on the 9th of September. The second thing is to draw German troops in, because it's not just Italian troops in Italy, it's Italian troops throughout the Balkans and the whole of the Aegean. So either the Germans have got to abandon all that, or they've got to replace them with their own troops. And the Allies know perfectly well that the Germans are going to replace them with their own troops. So they've got to come from somewhere at this critical stage of the war. As Chris pointed out, Kursk has already been and gone. They're in dire straits. Tunisia has been and gone. It's not looking good for Germany. They can ill afford to kind of start diverting troops from elsewhere. And this is part of the Allied plans, is, you know, they'll come from the Western Front, they'll come from the Eastern Front, pour into here. And that's a good thing. The other reason is to get to Rome, because that's a major psychological advantage. It's a huge and very important European capital. It has been the capital of Mussolini's fascist Italy until the moment that he's deposed in July. But perhaps the most important reason of all is this airfield complex around Foggia, because as you can see, it's an incredibly mountainous country, but here is one of the very few flat areas, and it is absolutely flat as a board. You can see the distant hills standing in the middle of here, but there's a whole load of airfields here, and the Allies are going to create even more. And the original reason for this is, again, goes back to Overlord, because the moment the troops land in Normandy, the race is on between which side is going to build up a decisive amount of men and material. First, is it going to be the Allies coming from across the sea, from between 120 and 80 miles across the sea in slow vessels, or is it going to be the Germans who are already on the continent? So clearly what you need to do is you need to slow up the German ability to reach Normandy, and you do that by destroying bridges and by destroying marshalling yards and railway lines and locomotives and their transportation network. But you can only do that by very accurate bombing, and that means low-level bombing, and you can't do that if you've got hovering Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf's German fighter planes overhead. So you need to get rid of them, and you need to get rid of the Luftwaffe over a large swathe of northwest Europe. And that means not only drawing up German fighters into the fight, it also means destroying the German aircraft industry. The problem is the 8th Air Force operating by day and Bomber Command operating by night, the moment they try and go on these deep raids, they get absolutely hammered. And actually, the same day that Italy campaign is greenlit on the 17th of August, and the day that the Sicily campaign is over, is also the day of the first Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, where 60 out of 320 plus bombers are shot down. Well, that's a 20% loss, and it's just completely unsustainable. The problem is there's no fighter that can escort the bombers that far into the Reich. Perfect for destroying the Ruhr, which is very helpfully in the western side of Germany, and is just a hop and a skip from East Anglia and Lincolnshire, where most of the bomber airfields are. But further in, that's a problem. So what are you going to do? Well, here's a potential solution, because if you've got bombers here, they can attack the southern Reich, where a lot of these aircraft factories are. There's a kind of race on to try and create a long-term fighter, a long-range fighter, and that actually is seeing service by the end of 1943, and that's the P-51 Mustang. But there's no certainty at the time that's made. And then actually Foggia falls on the 27th of September, so that's a massive big tick for the Italian campaign. But in the beginning of October is another very, very dark period for particularly the 8th Air Force, when they try again to try and hit these aircraft factories deep into the Reich. And again, they get absolutely massacred. It's a similar story as what's happened back in August with the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid. And so they actually then say, well, instead of sending 6 bomb groups, each of 72 heavy bombers, we're going to send in 21. And of course, that becomes the logistical priority, not the Allied armies on the ground. And so for the Allied armies, who are now struggling through unbelievable biblical levels of rain and mud and blown bridges, and you can see, as Chris pointed out, where there's mountains, there's rivers, and you can see them all flowing out to the sea. They've got to get past all that with lack of supplies in terrible conditions, terrible winter conditions, and they've got to get on with it, because now that you've got Foggia, you need to make sure you don't lose it. And the fact of the matter is, by the end of 1943, there are even more German divisions. In fact, there were when they landed in Salerno. There's more German divisions than there are Allies. And a localised counterattack by the Germans is not out of the question at all. So you've got to protect it. And so the appreciation, the strategic appreciation, is that you need to be at least 50 miles north of Rome to make sure that your huge investment that you're making in the Foggia airfields is safe. The people who are suffering are the army commanders, all their commanders, and all the poor bloody infantry on the ground.
Really, really good background there. Thank you both so much. Let's zoom in now and let's focus on the events of the Battle of Monte Cassino itself. OK, we've got a new map in front of us now of the battlefield itself. But before we get into the events of the battle, let's just run through some of the key statistics. The Allies committed around 240,000 troops from a host of different nations to the assault. This was backed up by hundreds of tanks, including M4 Shermans, Churchills and M5 light tanks. They had over 3,800 aircraft at their disposal, hundreds of which took part in the bombing of Monte Cassino Abbey. Casualties were heavy at over 55,000. The Germans were weaker in numbers, with around 100,000 men. Small numbers of Panther tanks and under 500 aircraft were available. German casualties stood at around 20,000, and it's estimated about 2,000 additional civilians lost their lives. Now let's just talk about what we've got in front of us here. This is a map of the battlefield. Crucially, you can see the Gustav Line itself here. You've got Mark Clark's US 5th Army here. Up here you've got Sir Oliver Lee's British 8th Army. And you've got Anzio as well, where the beachhead is established too, and we'll come on to that in time. James Holland, just tell us a bit about the Winter Line and the defences that the Germans are trying to hold on to here.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, they've managed to take Naples on the 1st of October. This is US 5th Army, which includes British units, let's not forget. They then cross the River Volturno, which is a considerable river crossing that they have to do. And then they move up to the... and all this has been delaying tactics by the Germans while they're preparing these two lines. The Gustav Line that runs all the way across, and the Winter Line that comes in here with Monte Cassino here and Monte Sammucro as the two 3,000-foot high sentinels guarding the Mignano Gap, which is this tiny little bit. You can see the railway line and the Via Casalina, Highway 6, the old Roman road from Naples to Rome, coming through this narrow defile. And so this is kind of like a double lock system. And actually, they've done incredibly well to get through that by the end of December. I mean, some of the fighting up on Camino, particularly, and on Sammucro, has just been atrocious. And it's amazing. You can go and stand on the top of Sammucro. It's 3,000 foot high. It's like razor-sharp ridges, absolutely full of smashed stone as a remnant from the battle where artillery shells were landing. And, you know, the Texan Division, the 36th Texan Division, the T-Patches, were attacking across here with the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment in the middle of the night, in the middle of December. I mean, it is absolutely astonishing what they achieved. Huge losses, it has to be said, but huge losses to the Germans as well. And they eventually broke through. Then the Germans made the absolutely ridiculous decision to fight in front of the Gustav Line while they could finish the defences, but, you know, to achieve very little apart from getting more German troops slaughtered. And then by the middle of January, 5th Army is pulling up to the Gustav Line. And the idea is to try and assault this sequentially in a series of different punches. So the first one is on the night of the 17th, 18th, and this is 10 Corps, British 10 Corps, part of US 5th Army. 56th Division, 5th Division are attacking here, and they do manage to get across, but they don't do the complete breakthrough. Then subsequently, you've got on the night of the 19th, you've got the British 46th Division crossing the Garigliano here. But unfortunately, the Germans, in response to the crossing further south 2 nights earlier, have released some sluice gates in the Liris. So it's swollen massively, and the current is much, much stronger. And then, and so they're just unable to get across. And then the following attack is by the 36th Texan Division, who had been on the top of Sammucro just a month earlier. And they've got to try and get across the Rapido, and they try and cross in 2 places. The problem is that actually the Texans have been given a huge amount of assets. They've been given something like 350 Sherman tanks and tank destroyers, which are Sherman tank chassis with a high-velocity anti-tank gun on, plus a battalion of quadrants, which are vicious 50 caliber machine guns, 4 of them mounted on the back of a half-track, and they're light anti-aircraft guns primarily, but you can absolutely turn them horizontally. Not one of those is used in the assault, and what you really want is to use those for suppressing enemy fire while the crossing's made, but that doesn't happen, and consequently it fails.
We'll come on to the 4 assaults in a bit more detail in a moment, but Dr. Chris Parry, we should mention what happens at Anzio. So just after the first assault, what happens here? OK, so in January 44, Churchill's had this idea. He's been recovering from pneumonia in Marrakesh. And he says, well, you know, perhaps we ought to try and go behind the Gustav Line. And in fact, the general who is slated to lead it, a chap called John P. Lucas, says, you know, this has got the odour of Gallipoli about it, with the same amateur on the coach's bench. And he's not happy at all with the idea that he's going to be invited to put 2 divisions, which is not a great assault force, bearing in mind that most assault forces in the Second World War are about 5 divisions, on the beach here behind the German lines. Essentially, you've got 2 divisions worth of troops, you've got commandos, and you've got 3 ranger battalions as well. So it's quite front-loaded in that respect. They arrive, they land at Anzio, and there's no Germans there. In fact, you know, probably a few out foraging, and that's it. And they say to the locals, you know, where are the Germans? And everybody goes, well, they point towards Rome. And they land. And I'm afraid Lucas, who I'm not a great fan of Lucas sort of looks around, sees no Germans, but acts as if there are Germans there, because he stays and consolidates, waits for his supplies, says, I'm not moving up here. What has made it slightly different for Lucas is Mark Clark has said to him, I remember what happened at Salerno, don't stick your neck out.
So Lucas stays there to the end of the month. And on the 30th of January, Kesselring has already organised a substantial number of German troops to come down, including 2 divisions from Rome, to counter the landing. And in conjunction with substantial amounts of aviation and also artillery and mortars, they start pummeling this enclave here that the Allies have actually put in place. And bearing in mind that the Anzio landing is supposed to assist the Cassino operation, it's become a bit of a liability at this stage.
James Holland, let's talk about the 4 assaults on Monte Cassino itself.
Can I just say one thing about Anzio first?
Yeah, go for it.
The restraining factor in all of this, the obvious thing to do if you've got a really, really strong line and a very, very mountainous terrain is to do an outflanking amphibious operation.
Yeah.
The problem is there just aren't enough landing craft for all the jobs that they want to do. You know, the Allies are in a hurry. They want to win the war as quickly as possible, but you need a huge amount for Overlord, which is going to come at this point now in the beginning of June rather than beginning of May. You need huge amounts for the massively increased scale of the Pacific operations, which are all amphibious. And they just don't have enough. I mean, it's interesting that between May 1942 and April 1943, the Americans alone built 8,719 landing craft of various kinds. But it's just not enough. And this is why when you have 4,127 allocated for D-Day when it finally takes place on the 6th of June 1944, for Salerno, you've only got 359. For the operations of 8th Army down in the Toe of Calabria, you've only got 268. It's not enough. And they don't have enough for this. And the reason they were able to have enough to try this operation now is because of the delay to D-Day, which has gone from May to June. And that gives them this narrow little window, which is why they're in such a rush to use this and take the most of this, try and unseat the Gustav line. The idea behind Anzio is to have it as a punt. This is a punt. Try and get to the Alban Hills, get into the high ground, threaten the Germans, do all this sequential punches all at the same time in January to support it. Hopefully that'll unseat the Germans. What's really interesting about this is literally every single German commander in Italy is going, we need to pull back and we need to pull back fast. The one person who isn't is Field Marshal Kesselring, who is a field marshal, a Luftwaffe field marshal. And he does so because he only stays there because Hitler is telling him to. And he's sort of slavishly devoted to his vow to do whatever Hitler tells him to do. But everyone else in Germany is saying that shouldn't happen. This doesn't achieve what they hope it to achieve, but there are huge advantages to having this bridgehead here behind the enemy lines.
Well, let's do a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the 4 assaults on Monte Cassino. Obviously, there's loads of detail we could go into, and frankly, if you want to get the detail, read Cassino 44. It's a brilliant book. You go into it really well. Let's go through them. So the first assault, where does it take place? And we'll move some of these blocks around on the map as you're doing it.
So we've had these attacks along here.
Yeah.
So the main one is coming in to Cassino, and this is the 34th Red Bulls Division. Oh, sorry, I'm using the wrong one.
Yeah, so black is going to represent the Allies here.
So it's the 34th Red Bulls Division, which is a National Guard division. It's the first troops to land in Britain in January 1942. They then serve in Tunisia, where they do badly to start off with, and then really massively pick up by the end of the Tunisia campaign. And then at the same time, we've got the French attacking up here, north of Monte Cassino. And this is the French Expeditionary Corps. It's only 2 divisions at this stage, and they're all a part of the French Army of Africa. And the rebels do pretty well. You know, they get above it. They get sort of 2/3 of the Monte Cassino massif, which sort of tapers at the end. And it looks like they're so close they can almost touch the Liri Valley, but they just can't quite get there. They haven't got quite enough. And then this is the point where General Alexander, who is the Army Group Commander, the overall commander of 5th and 8th Armies, decides to create a new corps. And he creates it with Bernard Freyberg, who's a New Zealander, who's a Victoria Cross, because he is the only divisional commander who's a 3-star general. He's a lieutenant general rather than a major general, which is the normal rank for a division. So he's given the corps. The problem is he's one of these very over-promoted people. He's a brave as a lion, and you can't fault him from that point of view. And if you sat next to him to dinner, you'd probably think he was great. But he's just over-promoted. He's not the sharpest tool in the shed. And he makes a catastrophic decision, which is rather than go with his subordinate, Francis Tucker, who's the commander of the 4th Indian Division, which is part of the New Zealand Corps, instead of doing his plan, which is to go further north, where you can attack on a wider front, he insists on attacking on a narrow front. On these ridge lines. And the problem is that's canalising the troops as they're getting across. So Tucker says to him, well, if you're going to do that, if you're going to insist on that, what you're going to have to do is pummel the entire Monte Cassino massif with very, very heavy ordnance. And I'm talking about 4,000-pound bombs, 2,500-pound bombs, Kitty bombers, he says, single-engine bombers will not do. You know, this is a job for the big guys. And then you need to send in the infantry immediately afterwards. That has to be absolutely coordinated. Tucker then falls very, very badly ill, so he's out of the picture. Freyberg disappears off to 5th Army headquarters and says, what I want is 36 Kitty bombers to destroy the Abbey. And it's not the same thing at all. They do a little bit more than that, but not much more than that. The bombing comes over on the 15th, and the reason they're coming over on the 15th is because they've learned from intelligence that the Germans are about to do their major counterattack called Operation Fischfang on the 16th of February, so they're going to be needed. So they do this without telling the infantry. The infantry are left stranded. The monastery's bombed, not the whole massive.
And they think the Germans are using the monastery, so they think they're in there.
That's not the issue. No. That's a complete red herring. It's not that. It's just the Abbey is the focus point of the end of the Monte Cassino massive. The Germans are actually on a much deeper in that. And what Tucker is saying is you have to pummel the whole massive, and that will include the Abbey, and that will be on your head and our heads if you do this. Are you completely aware of what you're suggesting here? Wouldn't it be easier to go further north where the ground is more open, you can attack on a broad front, and there's no abbeys in the way, historical abbeys to destroy? But Tucker doesn't. But Freyberg doesn't go with it, and Clark is dead against it, appeals to Alexander, and Alexander says, I think if we're asking a corps to attack at such a tough opposition, such a tough position, we should support him in any way that the corps commander thinks is necessary. So it goes in, but Chinese whispers are that what they attack instead is the monastery rather than the whole massive. Just with very, very small bombs rather than very large ones.
Yeah, Chris, let's bring you in on the monastery, because this is one of the most controversial bits of the entire Monte Cassino campaign, because actually it ends up helping the Germans because the rubble is really good to defend.
Yeah, I mean, what's really interesting about the monastery is the Germans themselves thought it was going to be destroyed. And before the campaign starts, they actually remove all the treasures and historic manuscripts, and quite a lot of the monks as well. The problem is you've got refugees in there, you've got some of the monks hiding in the vaults, and a general agreement between the Germans and the Allies that actually will keep it clear. But as James says, the military sort of pressure for it was quite great. And it happens to be another feature on this landscape which we have to neutralise. It's as simple as that. Very regrettable. And I agree with James. I don't think that Freyberg was a bear with a big brain, that's for sure. I mean, this is a guy who swam ashore in Gallipoli and got his VC doing this, and things like that. And he does exactly what the Germans expect him to do, and everything is lined up to counter it. But as far as the monastery is concerned, once it's destroyed, it is absolutely the perfect thing to defend, because you couldn't, if you're a sapper, if you're an engineer, build better obstructions and better things to hide behind than the ruins of the Abbey.
I'm just going to put some red on the board to represent the Germans, because in terms of numbers here, we're talking, what, about 3-1 from the Allies? Well,
yeah, the issue is the Germans start off with quite good numbers at the beginning of January, but they're rapidly depleted. So the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, which has been spread to the 4 winds in the campaign so far and very, very badly abused by Kesselring, finally comes together at Cassino. But at this stage, you've only got about 2,500 men instead of 17,000. So it's massively depleted. And this is sort of very much seen across the park with the German 10th Army units. Less so at Anzio, where they're a little bit stronger. But I mean, Anzio forces here, you're talking about 120,000 German troops, but less so here.
At Anzio, at one stage, you've got 10 German divisions surrounding, 5 Allied divisions. Now, you've got to say that these divisions by this stage are about 2/3 the size of what they should be. But 10 divisions is substantial. And they were looking to rub out the Anzio pocket. There's no question about that. And if you look at the attacks, they're very serious attacks.
They are serious attacks, and what happens, which is an advantage to the Allies, is that in attacking they get attrited pretty badly. I mean, they lose huge numbers of casualties, which is why Fischfang, launched on the 16th of February, that's a disaster for the Germans because it doesn't work. And then they launched their last offensive, Zeitensprung, on the 29th of February, because it's a leap year that year. And that doesn't work either. And at that point, it becomes into this sort of horrid, Passchendaele-esque stalemate. Up on this side, you've got the wadis, which is this sort of weird, sort of leaf vein-like, looking from above, kind of narrow network of sort of dried up river gullies. And here it's all flat. This is the Pontine Marshes, which have been sort of reclaimed in the 1930s under a sort of fascist works project. But, you know, it's pouring with rain. It's absolutely filthy. The corpses are left rotting out in the open because there's snipers on both sides, etc., etc. It is absolutely hellish, isn't it, Chris? But,
but also, I mean, the Allies are bringing in vast amounts of artillery, aviation, and quite importantly, naval gunfire.
Yes.
Which is very, very heavy artillery from an infantry point of view.
Yeah, OK, so we've had the 2 assaults then. We've had the assault on the Abbey as well. The 3rd assault, they're trying to get through. What happens there?
Yeah, well, the decision is really made after the second battle that actually the main event is going to be in the spring when the weather dries. And Alexander is already planning to bring the bulk of 8th Army over to here, and they will take over the Cassino sector. 5th Army, which will be, again, the French Expeditionary Corps, and US 2 Corps will be to the southwest. But there is a kind of a good reason for doing one more effort to try and clear Cassino town and the massif before they launch that attack. You know, being in front of it would just be helpful. So they agree they'll do this after there's been 3 days of dry weather. That doesn't happen until the middle of March. And Freyberg is still in charge of the sector with his New Zealand Corps. And having completely misinterpreted what Tuka was saying to him at the beginning of February, he's now embracing Tuka's theories entirely and says, OK, well, we can do this, but we'll only do this if we can absolutely smother and completely obliterate Cassino town first. And Clark sort of is a bit dubious about this. He said, well, OK, but if you can then smother it with infantry, that's fine. And the Indian sappers have created, the engineers have created a road around the back of Cassino, which becomes known as the Cavendish Road. So we'll launch a tank attack up the back there as well. And it'll all be coordinated. So we'll have the destruction of the town followed by an artillery barrage. Then the infantry can go into the town. The 4th Indians can climb up Monastery Hill. Another assault can be made around the back. It'll all happen at once, overwhelm the enemy, and that should do the trick. And Clark actually was quite right about that. That should have done the trick. So the bombers come over on the 15th of March. They've absolutely pulverised the town. Then 195,969 shells are fired at it. That finishes off the job. Half the German defenders are killed in that process. And Freyberg sends in 1 battalion of New Zealand troops, which amounts to about 800 men. A 2nd battalion starts to sort of inch in later on that evening. But that is it. The attack on the hill is not coordinated. The armoured attack around the back doesn't happen for another 4 days. So the whole thing is a complete shower. And when the Germans come in and investigate where the New Zealanders are overnight following the bombing, they're absolutely stunned to discover that the town hasn't been completely occupied. The reason why Freyberg doesn't do this is because he's very worried about the state of the morale of his New Zealand division, because there's a mutiny going on back at home about furlough schemes. And that's filtered back, and it means that, you know, he's trying to preserve the lives of his New Zealand division as much as he possibly can. But there are other units that could have done that. There was the 78th British Division waiting in the wings that could have been brought in. So it is a complete fiasco. But thank goodness, after that, Freyberg and New Zealand Corps are kind of shifted out of the picture.
And then the 4th assault, the one that finally breaks the Gustav line?
Yeah, well, this is mounted by the 2 Polish Corps. And it's an amazing story because 2 Polish Corps is made up of people who were captured by the Soviets in 1939 and 1940, because it's often forgotten that while the Germans invaded Poland from the west on the 1st of September, the Red Army invaded from the east a couple of weeks later. And these are prisoners of the Soviets who were sent off to gulags in the first part of 1941 and then were slowly but surely released in the latter half of 1941 following the German invasion of Soviet Union Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. They were then released, told to kind of muster down in Uzbekistan. So for most of them, this involved at least a 2,000-mile journey to get to Uzbekistan, by which time most of them were struggling with malaria, typhus, typhoid, and various other horrible lurgies like dysentery. Those who survived that were then transported to Persia, Iran, transported across Iran into Iraq, and at Kirkuk they built up their strength, were issued with all the British kit and uniforms and all the rest of it, and started intensive training. They then finished that off in Palestine and then started to be transferred over to the Italian theatre at the end of 1943. And they'd been holding a bit of the line until the battle plan is made for Operation Diadem, which is not just the final battle on Cassino, but is part of a bigger attack to take Rome. And what happens there is they're given the task of clearing the Monte Cassino massif. Not the town, just the Monte Cassino massif. So they move up and take over positions from the Texans and the 4th Indian Division in secret, and then launch their attack in the early hours of the 12th of May 1944. 44, part of Operation Diadem, the bigger battle. And that initial assault is not successful, but it is only after that first assault that they start doing vigorous patrol work at night. And then they finally, for the first time of any Allied troops, realise the key to the German defensive system on the Monte Cassino Massif, which is a figure of 8. And the apex of the figure of 8 is at a high point on a bluff on one of these ridges that I mentioned earlier, called Snake's Head Ridge. And the end of that bluff is called Point 593. And that is the key to unlocking the Monte Cassino Massif. And what they realise is that to undo this, every time you take Point 593, there is fire coming from either side of these circles pouring into it, which means the Germans are then able to retake it again. So to take the whole position successfully, you need to overwhelm more than 50% of these 2 circles of this figure of 8 of defences of mortars and machine guns and all the rest of it to win. And they finally do that on the night of the 16th, 17th of May. And
then, Dr. Chris Parry, we should say the significance of them breaching the Gustav Line is that then they are able to go north and they liberate Rome a couple of days before D-Day.
Yeah, I mean, I think James has explained it really well, but at the same time, you've got to break out from Anzio.
Yeah.
That's sort of coincidental with it, and you get that occurring. What's important to recognise about this last effort is substantial amounts of the 8th Army have been brought across to reinforce the 5th Army. So the only way you're going to overcome German resistance, the way they've set themselves up, the terrain and everything here, is to bring lots of mass in. And that's what really does the trick in the end. I think one thing, James, you'll recall is the turning moment that was produced by the French, of course. French Army of Africa, the Goumiers. These are people from North Africa who play a fairly stunning role in this final battle in actually turning the flank of some of the German defences here. And as James mentioned, you've got the Indian division, and the Germans themselves said that's probably the best division we faced here. That's a mixture of obviously European officers and Indian soldiers, but they were quite distinguished in this. And as you say, that provided the momentum as the Germans. And we should say the Germans actually said, I think we'd better get out of here. This is not a rout. The Germans saw the writing on the wall. They saw what was happening, and they start withdrawing pretty rapidly. And they've got a good plan for getting away, which we'll discuss. But suffice to say, you've got the breakout from Anzio, you've got the 5th supplemented by the 8th coming through, and everybody's going, right, which way do we go now?
And they end up liberating Rome. There we go. That is the real history of the Battle of Monte Cassino. Let's undo all of that now. This is History Undone. OK, this is what we love doing on History Undone. How could the Battle of Monte Cassino played out differently? One thing we probably should just tie up briefly first, Dr. Chris Parry, what happens famously after Monte Cassino is the push for Rome, and there's this sense that Mark Clark basically goes, I want to be the one to liberate Rome.
Oh, there's no doubt that Mark Clark wanted to liberate Rome. He was talking about it from Salerno onwards. And it was a question of whether Montgomery would go off to do Overlord before they actually got up into Rome. But what you've got is obviously the Allies in full frontal mode here, going up the road towards here. And you've got this retreating, in good order, 10th Army. And the real thing that's associated with this campaign is whether the 10th Army could have been encircled and cut off, and obviously everybody captured or destroyed, and that Mark Clark instead decided that he'd go up the road to Rome. And Mark Clark gets a lot of bad press about that, but I think the truth is a bit more complex, isn't it?
Yeah, what's your take, James?
Well, it really, really is. And I remember very clearly some years ago standing about here thinking about the breakout and thinking, gosh, if I'd been Mark Clark, I'd have been a bit worried about my left flank as I was driving towards Valmontone and the Via Casalina, because along here is the bulk of the German 14th Army. Now, destruction of 14th Army is not in the Diadem plan. Operation Diadem is the battle for Rome, launched on the 11th of May. That's the big one, which includes the final Battle of Monte Cassino. And in that battle plan, it is 8th Army here who are going to be driving down the Liri Valley. And the expectation is that they will be in the lead, with the French on their immediate left and then the American II Corps on the coast coming in behind. So you would expect it to be like this. So the French there and 8th Army out here. So the idea is that at a certain point, the Germans pull back like this. The Allies strike out of Anzio and come in here so that the Germans pulling back from here get trapped, because all along here you've got mountains, so they're trapped there in this pocket there. In actual fact, what happens is 8th Army gets stuck there, the French go like this, the Americans go like this, then go like this, and at this point, 10th Army is not retreating down here, it's retreating down here and here and here. This way. There's 5 escape routes. Not a single German soldier escapes down the Via Casalina. So driving to Valmontone on this point here and cutting them off is all well and good, but they're not going to be cutting off any troops.
Yeah.
On the other hand, by going across here, you've got 14th Army on your flanks. So Clark sends some forces to Valmontone, but instead, now with all his forces together, the French are holding back. With all his forces together, says, actually, I'm going to turn up and face up the 14th Army directly. And everyone's incredulous because they think, well, they're not all of them incredulous, but some of them are incredulous because they think, why would you go there when you could go like this? And his point is, it's much better to confront the army full on. Now, that's debatable, but that's the reason for doing it.
Well, I tell you what, let's have this debate, because there is a big historical debate around Mark Clark, and I think there's a slight difference of opinion here. Dr. Chris Parry, give me your assessment of Mark Clark and what he does.
Well, there's no doubt. As James says it, there is a race for Rome. There's no question about it. And there is in the air who's going to get there first. I have to tell you, from my own experience in the Falklands, there was a race on between the Paras and the commandos who's going to get to Stanley first. So I recognise the symptoms of this. So all the while, Mark Clark is thinking about these tactical dispositions, but he's also thinking, I'm not letting the Brits or the French get there first, that's for sure. If anybody's going for it, then I'm going to get there. And you're talking about a guy who, when he gets to Rome, puts military police battalions on the outskirts to prevent the French and the British getting in there. So he's definitely got it in his mind. But, you know, James, I know from his book, has said, actually, there are valid tactical reasons for Clark doing that. I think he's got both things in his mind. And you get into a sort of cognitive dissonance thing by saying, this is what I think the enemy are going to do, because actually that suits my agenda, because I want to go for Rome anyway. That's my view.
James, put the case for Mark Clark, because some people go, he's got white line fever, he's going for the glory.
Well, first of all, I think he's got a good reason for wanting to go for 5th Army, which, let's face it, is a multinational, international army. It's not just American. It is American in name, but it's got British troops in it. And British troops are going into Rome as well as American troops with his 5th Army, because they're coming out of the Anzio bridgehead. There's no question that 5th Army has done the hard yards. Ever since Naples, it's been doing this. It's been 5th Army that's gone through the Winter Line, the Bernhard Line. It's 5th Army that's taken the brunt of these fighting. It's only in the last bit for Diadem that 8th Army's been moved across. So you and
the press releases are saying that. Mark Clark's press people, of whom he's got 50, are actually saying that.
But I think he's got valid reasons I think he's justified in thinking that it should be 5th Army's victory. So I don't have really a problem with that. And I don't really have a problem with ambitious generals either. But I think the issue here is really that the criticism is that he disobeyed orders and didn't go all out for Valmontone.
Yeah.
Valmontone is not really relevant. Doesn't really come into it. I think he has good reasons for going to Rome. I also think he has very, very good reasons for facing 14th Army full on. By doing that, he gets lucky because there is a break in the line, and it is the Texans who keep coming up in this story, who find the gap and are able to exploit it. The net result is that 14th Army, the German 14th Army, gets destroyed, and the 10th Army has been very, very badly mauled. In the original plan, 14th Army hasn't come into it at all, and 10th Army is going to be destroyed. Yeah. So the overall result is one army destroyed and another one badly mauled, rather than one army destroyed. So, you know, the net result is pretty good, and it is no question that it is the biggest Allied victory of the war up to that point on land. And yet here we are all these years later criticising Clark about it, criticising the Allies about it. It is a fantastic victory, brilliantly fought, and that's partly because the planning of it is really good, because it's done on a kind of two-punch front. Alexander has made sure that we've got enough men so that if the plan does go awry, and as everyone knows, that's the first thing that happens in a battle, you've still got the balance to be able to respond to that. The interesting thing about Clark and his obsession with Rome is that, to start off with, before the battle happens, Oliver Leese, who is the 8th Army commander by this point, because Monty's gone back to Europe, is goading Clark and saying, well, you know, last one in's the rotten egg, that kind of thing. Yeah. And you can see in Clark's diary and his letters, he's getting really, really agitated. But as II Corps and the French start to take a lead, he starts to realise that he hasn't got to worry about 8th Army anymore. And it just disappears completely. Those concerns, that paranoia, that chip on his shoulder, completely disappears. From the middle of May onwards, you don't see it again. And it's just an absolute given that he's going to go in. And I think you can also argue, and this is General Truscott's argument, who is the Sixth Corps, American Sixth Corps commander, that actually it would have been easier to get into Rome if he had gone all out for Valmontone.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's the debate. That's a tactical debate rather than, about Clark's ego. So you could argue that actually by confronting 14th Army and attacking them uphill is quite a military punt and might have really backfired. So, the point is, of all of this, it's not black and white. There are no villains really in the Italian campaign on the Allied side. It's a fantastic victory. It's an amazing victory. And of course, from a publicity point of view and from news around the world, it just gets consumed by D-Day, which happens effectively the following day.
Yeah, and Chris, is there any scenario in which the Allies don't get to Rome? How would that have happened?
Oh, I think if there'd been the sort of planning that we associated with the first three battles at Cassino continued, if Anzio had been rubbed out, I think that would have been a very interesting situation, especially as the Allies were reinforcing. We had 5 divisions in there at one stage. If that had become a Stalingrad, that would have been a bit damaging. My own view is we're fighting in the wrong place. Now, I've got an amphibious background. If you look at what the Germans are saying, the Germans said, look, if you'd have landed further up, north of Rome, in Livorno, Leghorn, or Civitavecchia, we'd have been absolutely stuffed because you'd have actually cut off every single amount of troops that we had in the south of the country. And that's what they were expecting. They were geared for that. And I must say that one of the disappointments that I have about the way the campaign operated is that Alexander himself, who actually delivers in the end, sort of makes it up as he goes along. You don't see any evidence of what I call strategic planning at all. He's got 2 very egotistical army commanders under him. As I said, one with 50 press people, another who's giving out signed autographed pictures of himself, rather like a film star. That's Montgomery. When Montgomery goes, you sort of fold into this sort of battle in a very haphazard way. And I do think they underestimated the way the Germans would be organised on the Gustav line. They actually used the folds of the topography really well. And we have to say that the 10th Army withdrawal, where it breaks down into Kampfgruppe, battle groups, and says, right, get out of here, is done exceptionally well. They're absolutely hammered, as James says, but these guys get out in the face of the enemy. My own view is that if you were going to go for this, as I said, you go further north. But the disappointing thing is none of these generals want to go outside the range of air cover.
And James, just before we get into the big long-term consequences of the Italian campaign, is there any way the Allies could have got to Rome more quickly? Let's say they didn't destroy the monastery.
Yeah, they could have got there a hell of a lot quicker if the Germans had done the sensible thing and retreated to the Pisa-Rimini line as they were originally planning to do. The thing is, the moment they lose Foggia, there's no reason for the Germans to fight south of Rome, because by this stage of the war, they're short of absolutely everything, and the one thing they're short of more than anything else is fuel. So the longer their lines of supply, which have got to come from the Southern Reich all the way down to south of Rome, which is a hell of a distance, the more fuel they're going to use, the more exposed they are to Allied air power and all the rest of it. From a strategic point of view, there's no huge benefit once you've lost Foggia to staying south of Rome. Whereas if you'd gone up into the Apennines and what becomes the Gothic line, roughly on the line from sort of Pisa to Rimini, they'd have been able to hold that much more tightly, because that is the one place in Italy where the mountains kiss both sides of the coastline uninterrupted. There are mountain passes and stuff, but it's a formidable place.
Hitler's original plan was
to
actually go further north and hold at the Alps.
Yeah.
He initially set Rommel up with 8 divisions there to say, right, this is where we're going to hold. And he until Kesselring started being successful down here, he'd sort of given Kesselring up.
Well, you see, I would argue that Kesselring isn't successful, because Kesselring puts all his eggs in one basket, putting them to going towards Salerno. And his plan is, I'll chuck everything at Salerno, kick that out, then I'll turn back to Apulia and kick out the 8th Army, which is in very small numbers. The problem is that doesn't work, and then he's left the back door open. So the British 1st Airborne Division, which has landed straight into Taranto, is able to go straight up and take Foggia on the 27th of September, while no one's looking. And, that's a really catastrophic mistake. And yet, rather than punishing Kesselring for cocking the whole thing up, He says, right, you are now in charge of all of Italy, not Rommel, and I want you to fight for every yard south of Rome. Maybe that is the punishment. I don't know. Depends on which way you look at it.
I mean, there is another thing, of course, is, and you see it in some of the conversations between Keitel, Jodl and Hitler. They're saying, well, actually, how many troops are we tying up down here?
Yeah.
We're anticipating a possible landing in France or, up near Calais in the Low Countries. Just how many divisions are we actually holding down ourselves here? So there's a mirror image here.
Yes.
We think we're holding down the Germans here. They're holding us down as well. And the more you can suck in, the more we like it.
Well, this has been really fascinating. We're going to leave the battlefield behind. Let's zoom out now and let's ask ourselves some big long-term consequences of what would have happened had the Battle of Monte Cassino played out differently and the Italian campaign played out differently. OK, we've got a new map in front of us. This is our favourite map. It's the big map of continental Europe as it would have been in 1944. Dr. Chris Parry, there is an argument, if we're looking at kind of big long-term consequences, that actually the Italian campaign was strategically pointless. I'm going to get your view on that in a moment, James, because I know you might disagree. But is that true? Did they need to go for Italy?
Well, I mean, the fact of life is, I mean, it was successful if you put all the pieces of the jigsaw together. I mean, my little musing on this is if D-Day hadn't worked, what are you going to do? Because you can't come back again that year, if at all, because the Americans aren't going to be very interested. The only open front that you've really got is in Italy. So it may well be you dominate the Mediterranean, the Italians have come over to your side, and if D-Day fails, you've got this as an insurance. If you hadn't done that, you'd have had to start all over again. The Germans would have been able to flood troops into Italy and also the Balkans, and it would have been a totally different prospect.
Well, that's a really interesting idea. James, do you agree?
Yeah, completely, yeah. Absolutely. And I think, to be honest, it's worth the punt. I mean, the problem is that the Allies, by the summer of 1943, they're in a hurry. They want to win the war as quickly as possible. And there's this constant sort of payoff between wanting to get on with it, but not wanting to have huge amounts of casualties. Yeah. Wanting to be absolutely everywhere, but not being able to be everywhere.
You can't have your cake and eat it.
Well, you can't quite. You know, they're always kind of wanting to do things 6 months ahead of where their supply lines really can afford them to be. Italy is an absolute case in point that they just don't have the assault craft that they need because it's not as high priority as D-Day and it's not as high priority as what's going on in the Pacific by this stage of the war. Yeah. So this is launched and mounted purely to support Overlord. Draw off German troops, get Italy out of the war, have an air base down here in Foggia from which to kind of attack the German aircraft industry in the southern right. And that's the reason for doing it. The problem is it's under-resourced, which means, and they're doing it in the middle, you know, the winter is appalling. So they're doing it in very bad terrain, in very bad conditions for the most of it, and the particular bit that we've been talking about. And the Allied armies that are doing it without the resources that they would need or be given it were they attacking in Normandy. And so that just means it's kind of very, very hard luck for the commanders on the ground, and very hard luck for the poor bloody infantry that are doing the fighting. I mean, it's really, really absolutely brutal. On the other hand, it is drawing off lots of German troops, and because they're fighting south of Rome, and because they're absolutely hammering the Germans in these battles in January, February and March, and into May and June 1944, the Germans are struggling. The Allies can afford to lose troops more than the Germans can at this stage of the war, and any troops that come away from the Western Front or the Eastern Front is good news for those two major fronts rather than this one.
Jay, I think both Jameses, I think the really interesting thing is if D-Day fails and the campaign axis goes to Italy at this point, the whole character of post-war changes. Because if you're penetrating from here, you're into Austria, Czechoslovakia probably. How far west do the Russians get? What point do you actually meet them?
That's a good point, yeah.
And absolutely right, James. You're also looking at the Balkans, and of course we know that Churchill at the time was obsessed with dealing with Greece and the Balkans. And in fact, if you look at Alan Brooke's diaries, he's saying he wanted to go for Rhodes for some reason. He had an obsession about the island of Rhodes. So we've got the whole focus coming towards the Balkans. The Americans were really suspicious about Churchill's designs on the Balkans. But if you think about it, if you orientate round to a front that comes up this way, the whole character of this strategic campaign changes. So do we see the Allies actually going into France through the back door instead of coming through the Channel?
Yeah.
And coming two ways out of here and actually meeting the Russians somewhere here? So the whole character, if that had happened, could have changed.
Well, James, do you think there's any scenario in which, if they don't breach the Gustav line, D-Day fails?
No, because of the pressure that they're mounting on the German line. But also because you need to protect Foggia and because you need to maintain the initiative. What you can't do is you can't take your foot off the clutch, can't take your eye off the ball. And then the Germans, with their superior numbers of divisions, particularly all these fresh divisions that they've got up in the north, which they're keeping for outflanking operations and, sundry other operations that might develop, they could be sent south, and then you've got a major reversal. So that's the issue. But I don't think it particularly matters whether they get to Rome or not, as it turns out.
And what if there wasn't the armistice between the Allies and the Italians? How does that change things?
I don't think you're setting foot in Italy at that point.
So the entire campaign's not happening?
Well, no, what you're doing is you're probably basing yourself in North Africa. You probably want to take Sardinia and Corsica at this point and use those. You've got 2 German divisions there at the time of the invasion of Italy. In fact, one is brought across to help in the Cassino campaign.
Actually, the French take them, don't they? In that summer?
They do. But what's interesting, I think you probably do take Sicily if you can. That was a quite simple operation in the end. And these 2 islands, and you project from here. I mean, the route, James, that I'm thinking about is this one that comes in on the coastal, the old Roman route, basically, that comes in here that you might want to get into France. But I think it's interesting what your priorities are going to be. If you come out the top here, the First World War, the Italians found it desperately difficult to get rid of the Austrians in the mountains until the end of the war. And frankly, the Austrians were on their beam ends. So that would have been an interesting front to hold. I suspect that would have gone very attritional here. And you've been looking for routes round. But in terms of air bases, you're here. And I think, as James sort of hinted earlier on, we probably would have looked here, actually, to try and actually give it another front. You've got the Russians coming into Hungary, Romania at this point, of course. So where do the lines of the Cold War settle?
Well, that's very interesting. Have you got a view on that, James?
Well, it's a salivating thought, isn't it, to think about it and where things might have been different. I mean, when Alexander does his strategic overview following the capture of Rome, he says if we push on, then they have the opportunity. If we burst out of the Apennines, because the Apennines sort of come around like this, and then you've got the Po Valley here, which is another bit of flat ground before you get to the Alps. He said, if you get into the Po Valley, then you've got the opportunity of turning right into the Balkans through the Ljubljana Gap, or you've got the opportunity of turning left into southern France. But let's maintain the initiative. You still got to get through the Alps, though. Whichever which way you look at it.
I mean, there's a lot of German aviation left here.
Yeah.
And so they're able to bring from short distances quite a lot of aviation to bear here.
Yeah.
And if you're not bringing it this way, tactical aviation, you've got a bit of a problem. But, they know you're not coming this year. How many panzer divisions can be deployed from France to oppose you here?
I mean, just on the wider campaign for Italy, because there are those, James, who say, as I mentioned, that it was strategically pointless, basically. It didn't achieve very much. And, of course, Napoleon had the old adage that Italy's like a boot and you enter it from the top. What do you say to those who say, no point in doing it whatsoever?
Well, I would say that there's a huge crisis facing the Allies' command in the autumn of 1943, late summer and autumn of 1943, which is how are we going to clear the skies of northwest Europe from the Luftwaffe before we do the invasion of Normandy. And that is the most important thing. And so you're thinking of anything you can do that will help that. And there's no question that having Allied bombers here, attacking up to here, is a hell of a lot easier than from them attacking down there.
Yeah. So,
that is the prime reason for doing it and drawing off troops. Don't forget, the Balkans, Greece, Italy and the Aegean, that absorbs some 50 German divisions. Those are 50 German divisions which can't be here and can't be here. So, for me, it's absolutely worth the punt. The tragedy of it is that it's not supported enough by the Combined Chiefs of Staff with enough landing craft.
It's not the primary theatre.
It's not the primary theatre. And so it's the people on the ground who are suffering. The criticism has always been laid at Alexander, at Clark, at Monty, and subsequently Oliver Leese. I don't really direct any criticism to them. I think they do as well as they possibly can do, given a very, very poor hand. If there's criticism of it, it's for the Combined Chiefs of Staff who are just committing this without committing the resources as well.
They're doing it from distance too.
They're doing it from distance. They're looking at maps, not the reality.
If you're looking at the way in which they're briefed at the Combined Chiefs of Staff, the amount of briefing they get for this is about 1/10 of what they're getting for the Pacific and D-Day. So that shows you where their interest levels lie. The other thing I bring out here is most of the people at the time thought Kursk was a one-off. Can the Russians actually sustain it? And it's not until Bagration is successful that actually people believe...
In the summer of 44.
Yeah. But people believe that the Russians might actually, once they've destroyed Army Group Centre, people believe the Russians could actually come west. We're being very deterministic because we know the Russians came west. Okay, at the time, people weren't actually saying that.
So if the Italian campaign doesn't happen and the Germans don't have to divert resources, maybe it doesn't play out in the way that we know it.
Absolutely. And just as we said the Cold War lines could have been different from this direction, it could have been different if the Russians were the only ones actually on the continent of Europe, north of the Alps.
Final thought from each of you. James Holland, had the Battle of Monte Cassino not played out the way it did, let's say it took longer for the Allies to reach Rome, fundamentally, does that change the outcome of the war or the timescale for the rest of the war?
No, I mean, my own view is that Germany's lost the war by Christmas 1941 and irretrievably by the summer of 1943. I think what is uncertain is what the time frame is going to be thereafter, what twists and turns there might be. What happens in Italy, what happens on Monte Cassino and the Gustav Line in the first half of 1944 is not going to change the outcome of the war in any stretch or fashion. It's about, but it might make it kind of longer, it might make it shorter, it might, you're talking about kind of comparatively small tweaks. The overall picture is unchanged. It is about how it affects kind of, the war in terms of sort of weeks and months rather than years.
And that's a good point, and probably a good note to end on. Even though it's not necessarily a massive turning point in the war, does not mean that we should underplay its significance.
Not at all. And I think what we need to remember is the amount of lessons and the amount of doctrine that comes out of this campaign. What is really disappointing, by the time we get to Korea, which involves similar terrain, similar sort of environments and things like that, everybody's forgotten it. Which is a bit of a shame. So every generation has to reinvent, in some ways, the doctrine that it uses by learning by doing. And certainly, this is considerable learning by doing, which bears no relation really to anything else that is taking place in the continent here. It's of itself. But hey, it's a massive source of anecdote, history and lessons. So that's good in itself, I think.
Well, Chris, James, thank you both so much. This has been genuinely fascinating. And I think what we can say about the Battle of Monte Cassino is that, yes, it could have played out differently. Certainly the Allies could have liberated Rome even quicker had, for example, they not launched that assault against the monastery in the Second Battle of Monte Cassino. That may have helped things. Also, there is a scenario in which actually they liberate Rome even later. And then what is the impact then on D-Day? I think realistically D-Day still goes ahead and still succeeds. That seems to be the consensus. But if D-Day did fail, how does that change the significance of Italy? Do the Allies then push up through Italy, potentially into the Balkans? How does that affect the way the lines of post-war Europe are drawn? Does that affect the Cold War into the latter half of the 20th century? Some really significant long-term consequences, potentially all stemming from Monte Cassino and the Italian campaign. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to James Holland and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. And a reminder that James's book, Cassino 44, is out now, and we will be back undoing more battles from history very soon. But in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History, on YouTube. And if you like this, why not subscribe to Times Radio's main channel, where you can catch me presenting Frontline, our interview series about the war in Ukraine and other global conflicts. That's it from us. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.